Welcome to Open Container. I'm Doug Schnitzbahn. I'm a journalist, writer, and overall lover of the outdoors. I've fought wildfires, reported on national politics, published magazines, and I have kayaked alongside beluga whales. On this podcast, we're going to have an open conversation about culture, conservation, policy, business, issues that matter the most to the outdoor community. Let's get some. My favorite thing about going on a river trip is slipping into river time. You put away the watch. You tell time only by the rhythms of the day, where the sun is in the sky, how your body feels. It's a wonderful thing to fall into. You eat at more regular times. Your mind focuses on what's in front of you, unloading the boat, setting up camp, scouting rapids, moving the oars through the water. It's an essential experience for those of us who suffer from ADHD. Without the distractions of screens, deadlines, and clocks, we find the space to thrive. Out here, you react, you breathe, you take your time, you get the job done. And throughout it all, the overriding controller of how you live is simply the flow of water, never ceasing, calming in its consistency, beautiful in the song you can almost hear if you listen closely enough as it moves. When I'm out on a great river, like the Colorado through the Grand Canyon or the Oahe through desolate sagebrush steppes with cliffs of rhyolite formed from the first eruption of the Yellowstone hotspot rising on either side, I feel a sense of the eternal. And I think about how our conception of time is limited by how we measure it. It's important to go on a river trip to experience time in this way, as a function only of how you live and observe. We are not meant to live in a binary world. Much of our distress comes from being forced to conform to screens and devices that are supposed to make our lives easier, but instead leave us less happy, chained more tightly to our ever-scrolling routine that takes us farther and farther from nature. So I suggest, take a river trip when you can. You can feel a similar rhythm on a backpacking trip or climbing adventure, but there's something unique about returning to the water each day, this moving source that carries you forward. It's an easy metaphor for life, of course. Heraclitus knew that. River guides know it. In the book Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse wrote of Gautama Buddha becoming not a god, but a person, finally finding enlightenment as a simple river keeper. He says, "Have you also learned that secret from the river, that there is no such thing as time? That the river is everywhere at the same time, at the source and at the mouth, at the waterfall, at the ferry, at the current, in the ocean and in the mountains, everywhere, and that the present only exists for it, not the shadow of the past, nor the shadow of the future." It's a metaphor, yes, but one that we need. One of the greatest moments of my life was sitting in a small pack raft, floating down the immensity of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon in utter silence. It has stayed with me and comes back to me. When we feel that sense of the eternal, we become better able to return and function within a world constrained by the limits of technology and jobs. But it's always good to remember what's out there, that we can always return to the flowing of water, to the peace the river gives us. Because the eternal is the only thing we truly have to offer us solace, and all the other noise and production in our lives do not. My guest today understands river time and the healing power of rivers. A leading whitewater expert, Bridget Crocker has guided expeditions down many of the world's greatest river canyons. Her work has been featured in Outside, Men's Journal, and National Geographic Adventure magazines, among others, and she's a contributor at Patagonia, Lonely Planet, and the Best Women's Travel Writing. Her new book, The River's Daughter, has been called a powerful narrative of resilience and self-discovery, navigating the tumult of family upheaval and personal trauma, by author Adrienne Brodeur, and it is a must-read for those of us who have spent time on rivers and who have found healing in the wild. Now let's open the container with Bridget Crocker. Okay, and today we are opening the container with Bridget Crocker, the author of The River's Daughter, an incredible book that is coming out on, what's the exact date we're coming out?
June 3rd is our pub date.
Fantastic. And look for that. And where can people find it?
Anywhere you buy books, but hopefully you're going to buy books from your local independent bookseller.
That's right.
Or bookshop.org is a great place too.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm extremely excited to have Bridget here. I've been trying to get together with her for a long time to have this conversation. And I'd like to throw a kind of good fast pitch for you to start the interview. And wanted to ask you something that's prominent in the book, I think, but do rivers really speak to you?
Like in a voice or
Yes.
speak to me metaphorically?
Both.
Okay. Well, certainly, capture my imagination and have since I was very young. I grew up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, on the banks of the Snake River, south of town. And I spent a lot of time, just with the river and finding solace and refuge from a troubled childhood on the banks of the river. And, it was a place where I went to be nurtured and just to kind of reset. It was and still is the place where I go to reset my nervous system. And I also, I'm from a long line of people with ADHD, which I think is interesting. Talking, in an outdoor industry podcast, I've long said that most river guides have ADHD. Like it's kind of a prerequisite to be successful on the river because you have so many things coming at you so quickly all the time. You have to be able to take that all in. And growing up the way I did in such chaos, I learned to be hyper vigilant at a young age, and my nervous system developed in a way where it was like highly attuned to a lot of different input. And then I also genetically am predisposed to ADHD. So one of the other great benefits, aside from being able to really multitask in a natural environment, is that the ability to hyper focus, and that is and get into a deep state, right? And I do that when I'm writing, and I also do that when I'm on the river and next to it as a kid. So when I get in that hyper focused state, I am able to blend into my environment in such a way that I become the environment, and so it is speaking to me. It's like in my imagination. It's sometimes it is. I can hear a voice sometimes, but often it's just like a very intense awareness, a thought, and it kind of vibrates in my whole body.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like a hearing voices thing, right? A crazy thing. I know I certainly hear rivers sing. I've slept by the banks of rivers before, and it's almost like you hear this music or singing or sound in the background, right?
Yeah, and also just as somebody with a highly attuned nervous system, almost like a clairsentience. Like I can feel the energy of people, very intensely, and also of natural beings, trees, rivers. It's not just limited to rivers; it's to all creatures and beings.
Yeah, and I think what you say about ADHD is really interesting too. I know I've been told I have it, and I guess I'm not surprised. But and as you said, most outdoor.
I bet that 90% of the people listening right now are like, "Yeah, me too."
I guarantee you're right, and hopefully they'll make it all the way through. And I do think that it's interesting, right? Like we're probably, those of us with ADHD are probably not programmed to sit in front of a computer or do the office work or that. We're more programmed to deal with sudden challenges that you have to face being a river guide, working in the outdoors, being an EMT as I was, right? Like in some way, we're more attuned to these things that we used to have to do as human beings for hundreds of thousands of years, right?
Right. It's evolution. Yeah. Being able to survive in your environment. That's key. And luckily, for me, the way that I grew up, perfectly prepared me for a life as a river guide in running serious whitewater.
And how do you think that ADHD helps for whitewater even?
It's just the ability to get into that deep meditative state, when I'm really on, and I think skiers experience it too. I grew up in Jackson Hole, so I'm a skier. And when you get into that like hyper focused state and you're just kind of in that zone and flowing, uh, that is a function of ADHD. That's the other side of it. And also just being able to make quick decisions. I've noticed, like when I'm in a boat with other people, like R2ing with another guide, that my ability to see what's coming and happening happens a few beats before other people. And I think that's because of this like super hyper vigilance that I grew up with.
Yeah, and that's interesting too. I think for, if you're a parent of a kid who has these kind of behaviors, like it's really important to get them doing outdoor sports maybe, or, something that has them reacting to the world in a different way than school might.
Yeah, and I was fortunate to have my father had severe ADHD. He wasn't diagnosed until he was in his 60s, and we had no idea. Like my dad had severe learning deficits that went undiagnosed for most of his life, and contributed to his inability to self-regulate, which is a big part of the book and
Yeah,
theme of the
yeah.
book. But once he did get diagnosed and got the help that he needed and was able to, we knew what the problem was and there was a solution. It was like a whole different deal.
That's fantastic. I guess getting back to rivers for a moment, is there, well, you've been on rivers all across the world, you've been a guide. Is there one river in particular that really captures your imagination, that really gets you going as a river guide?
It's interesting. That's the question I'm asked the most is, like
Oh, okay. Oh, no.
no, but it's asked the most because I think that what people are really asking with that question is like, what river should I go on next?
Hmm.
In some ways, and like, what is the best river? And, each river has it's like saying, what's the best person? Everybody
Right.
has different personalities, but one that I go back to again and again is the Snake River because it's my home river, so it's like going home. And another that I try to do every year is the Pequari River in Costa Rica. I love the Pequari. It's just a magical place, and it completely envelops my heart. And it's where I feel love the most intensely.
Huh. How long have you been going there?
The first time I went there was in like 1996. And I lived in Costa Rica for a while and worked down there for a number of years.
Interesting. Is there one particular river that like scares you, or one spot that you're like, oh man, I don't want to go back to that one, or that one's got something for me? I mean, I know I feel this way about certain peaks or maybe ski runs or something, right? One that's got a hex.
A hex. That's interesting. I talk about the Zambezi a lot, and
Yeah.
Nyami Nyami, the river god of the Zambezi, and how, of all the rivers I've ever been to, I think Nyami Nyami and the Zambezi are the most in need of anger management therapy. But very, very similar to my father before he was able to get diagnosed and treated for his learning deficits. I love the saying that anger is hurt's bodyguard. And, like when there's that kind of anger and rage emanating from a being, there's hurt underneath it. So, the challenge, the hex is like, and the challenge is how I would look at it, is getting underneath that anger and the scariness to like what's underneath it and finding that connection.
And that's because the Zambezi, it's an incredibly high flow river, right? It's an absolute
Well,
blast
that's
of
one way
water,
of
right?
looking at it, but it's also in Tonga tradition, the Zambezi is very angry because of the dam that was built at Kariba
Oh,
that created Kariba Lake that
huh.
separates him from his wife, Katapo.
Have you felt the river anger? Do you think the river's a little more okay with you because you're
Oh no, the
understanding
river
and a guide?
is
And
no, very angry. No, I didn't get any special treatment on the Zambezi. I got my ass kicked on the regular there.
right. So for people who haven't been there, or don't know about it, how would you describe just the experience of running that river? It's insane, right?
Like being lost at sea in a squall. Yeah, it's super huge hydraulics. Um, and even if when you're online, like you could flip. It's like 50-50. It doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just rolling the dice. Yeah.
And did you go down? Have you flipped in it?
Yeah. Yeah, I describe flipping in one of the
Yeah.
chapters, and going down to the dark, still place in the river. There's a Nyanja word
Yeah.
for it, Mwangala. And it's where the river is cold and deep and still. And that's where Nyami Nyami lives. The name of that chapter is Nyami Nyami's Lair.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of us who've spent time in water, fortunately or unfortunately, have been to that place before, right? That still cold place when you go under or you're way down deep. I mean, I used to experience it diving down. If you're grew up on the beach in the ocean, when you go way down in deep water, there is that stillness down there. And it's both frightening, but also in a certain way, it's compelling as well to be there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think in an ocean, you're expecting it to be that deep, but most rivers don't get to be, 20 feet deep. And so it's unique in that way. The gorge is, you have, 100,000 CFS cubic feet per second flowing over Victoria Falls and then constricted into this very narrow gorge. So the river, the water has no choice but to just go deep. And it's like 20 feet deep in a lot of places. So when you swim there, don't let go of the boat. I learned that. I swam once and let go of the boat, never again. And to this day, like I never am I away from the boat. When I fall out, like I find a way to cling on to it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you said the Snake River, though, is that's your home. That's where you keep going back to a lot.
Yeah.
It's also a river you enjoy sharing with people. And does it continue to surprise you? Does it continue to bring new things to you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The snake, I think, has always been the river that holds up a mirror for me, and shows me like who I really am and who I'm being. And if there's a discrepancy between those two things, like she lets me know right away. And I love going there. Last year I started teaching on the faculty with Jackson Hole writers, and I teach a class on the river. The river is guide and writing about the river and on the river and kind of how to, channel those stories and use the river to spark creativity. And I look forward to doing that again this July. I'll be there.
Yeah, and I loved how, in the press materials for your book, there was this great quote from you where you said, "May the river's daughter encourage and guide those who feel disconnected and disempowered to reclaim their volition and place in the world." And I love that coming from someone who's a guide themselves on the river, thinking of this book that's a memoir as also a guidebook, that it's something that can help people navigate the kind of life difficulties that you've had to navigate.
Yeah, that was really the impetus for writing and publishing the book. It started out as just a way for me to chart the obstacles that were in my life in the same way that I charted the obstacles on river expeditions. And then it became, sort of a way to help others navigate those obstacles, because as a guide, it's just part of my DNA to help people and to guide people. So, it is my hope that it finds its way to people who need it.
Who ideally do you want the book to reach and talk to and speak to?
Well, I think there's a lot of us who just feel very disconnected in many ways from ourselves, from our families of origin, from nature, from the society we find ourselves in, and we're stronger together. And that's one of the things that I've learned being a part of the river industry, the river culture, that, we can overcome a lot of things together, and building that connection and trust with the people around us is so essential.
Yeah, it's an important part of being both a river guide or spending on any time on the river, right? You have to have systems in place. When things go wrong on the water, it goes wrong
Yeah,
very,
there's no
very
single boat
quickly.
trips. Yeah, no,
So
single
I
boat
think,
trips are not a good idea. Two boats or more.
yeah. So I mean, that's a great thought too. Is you're not running the river alone, or you can't be
Hmm.
safely, right? And that happens in your book as well. What do you think is the key to what rivers and spending time on rivers and learning how to properly run rivers? I mean, what do you think at its base the most important thing we can learn is spending time on river trips and learning more about the water and how to be on the water?
Well, I mean, there's so many different components to, and that's what,
Yeah.
feeds the ADHD mind too. It's like, oh, there's the gear and there's the skill set that you need to navigate, and learning like the hard skills of rowing, and then there's reading water, and then there's group dynamics. There's so many components that keep you busy on river trips, and I think what I've found is like in guiding, thousands of river trips over the years in many, many countries, a lot of people come away with this sense of that they're stronger than they think that they are, and that's it. Like a lot of people are like, wow, I really am capable of a lot more than I thought I was capable of. People come from all walks of life. I've taken people from Park Avenue and, people who just from cities with no backgrounds in survivalist culture, which I was raised in. And, yeah, just learning skill sets and being surprised constantly that they do have the ability to adapt and to connect with nature in the way that they'd always imagined. All of us do with the help and guidance of other people who have those skills.
Have you had some clients in particular who you really saw change and transform on a river trip and maybe connected with them later and were able to really see how much you'd help guide their
Oh,
life
for
even, right?
sure. Like, oh, yeah. Even recently, I just, this was a crazy thing that happened. I was, for 17 years, my husband was he's a lifeguard supervisor for state parks in California. And so we lived in employee housing at Leo Carrillo State Beach and raised our girls there for 17 years. And we, survived the Woolsey fire in 2018. And I wrote a story about it for Westways magazine. And I was walking in the campground with one of my daughters, and this couple was like, "Are are you the woman who wrote the story in Westways magazine about the Woolsey fire?" And I was like, "Yeah, how did you know that?" "Well, I recognized you from the illustration." I said, "Well, that was an illustration of the back of my head. Like, that's wild." And then we start talking, and then, they're a real friendly couple. And they asked me where I was from, and I said I grew up in Jackson, Wyoming. And they said, "Oh, we went there once in like the early '90s, and we went rafting on the Snake River." And I said, "Well, I used to be a guide on the Snake
Oh
River."
no.
And they were like, "Well, we went with somebody that she looked like you." And then they start reciting like my safety talk back to me. I'm like, "But it couldn't have been you. It must have been somebody else." And this girl, she had leg hair. And I was like, I was the only blonde river guide with leg hair in 1991 in the Snake River. It was me. I was your guide. And so, we formed this fast friendship. This was like 30 years later or something. It was crazy to just bump into them and then have them start, in California, have them start reciting my safety talk to me. And one of the things that I love about guiding trips and like imparting, like, here's how you survive in nature to people who have no idea. There's a moment where there's this switch, where they go from like, oh, this trepidation of like, maybe I don't belong here, I don't know what I'm doing, to kind of like when you're on a roller coaster or something and you like get into this zone of exhilaration and surrender. And then it's like, yeah, they're just, fully open to the experience, and it's fueling them, and they're like channeling it, and they're aligned, right? That's when they
Yeah,
click
yeah.
into it. And that, I've seen so many people go through that process. And that's what I love about guiding, is being there for that, witnessing that.
I think also, for me on river trips, one of the most beautiful things is going on to river time, right? When you basically throw the watch out, throw the phone out, you don't do anything, and you really understand time. Maybe this is a good thing for those of us with ADHD, and if people listening here will know, those of us not good with deadlines or being on time, maybe we get back into the actual rhythm of time when we're on a river, when we're not looking at watches and electronics, right?
Yeah, well, much to my family's chagrin, I am always on river time. And so my daughter's like set an alarm on my phone, like, "Mom, don't forget to pick us up." Because when I'm writing, I'm, like super deep in it. And then I'll like just, come out of it with a start like, oh, the children, I have to go pick them up. And there's an alarm there for me, which is great. So, that's, one of the benefits of, being a creative person is like that ability to lose track of time and space, but it's not great for, having to run a schedule.
Yeah, I think we're way too similar here, Bridget, because that sounds like I'm
You're
sure
like,
my
I'm
kids are
feeling
like,
really
that's my
seen.
dad. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, in another way, like, do we experience time more realistically when we're on river time or on, writing time or, in these spots? Like, does it have to be that time is parsed into, small, obviously real divisions, minutes and seconds, or is there something else about the way the brain and the experience take in time that we can connect to when we're out there on a river trip or in the wilderness in general?
Well, yeah, that presence of being aligned in time and space to what you're doing. It's essential to how we were created as beings, and I think that's what feels so like a balm to your nervous system when you get into that place where you can just click into alignment. And there, I mean, for me, it's like this calm that washes over me, and then I can just be fully present. And I love that feeling too. I try to get into that zone every day with a walk or just to get out in nature and watch the birds, whatever it is that I can fit into my day. It's so important that we continue to nurture that connection.
And do you think the people who, go on river trips with you, do you think they can go away and bring that back to their daily lives and find a way to unplug in the same way? Or can that only happen in the wild?
It's interesting. I've been doing these women's adventure wellness retreats with a friend of mine, Jeremy Anderson, who does Ayurveda, and she's a river guide. We guided together on the Kern. And we decided that we would put together these women's retreats with writing and Ayurveda and the river. And we had no idea how it was going to go. We're like, let's just, she has ADHD too, because she's a river
Does.
guide.
We ought to, yeah.
So like, let's just see how it goes. And we'll throw all this stuff together. And it ended up being this amazing experience. And we brought, for the first couple of retreats that we did, our friends were kind of, the ones that were showing up on these trips. And so I had the benefit of like having that experience with friends of mine in LA who are writers and maybe not, they're maybe not people who are outdoor people necessarily, but they're just interested in going with me on a trip to see what it's like. And, then coming back, and they did have that experience on the river, and they're still cultivating it in their lives. A year later, their lives have changed, and it's awesome to see that continuum.
We were talking earlier about the river speaking to you, and there is one very specific scene in your book, in I believe the first chapter, early on when you were young, and you fall in the Snake River, and it does speak to you, and it tells you to swim, which is awesome. And that made me think too about another thing we can learn from the wilder rivers is to listen with our instincts, right? That we get cut off from that otherwise. I wonder how you're still able to, how you learned from that throughout your life. I think the book goes into it, obviously, but for the podcast, maybe you can talk about how the river telling you to swim, how is that a guide for the rest of your life, maybe?
Yeah, and that's an awesome question, and that's a huge part of why I wrote this book was, to illustrate like how our instincts inform us, and how do we find them, how do we reconnect with them, how do we listen to them, how do we implement them in our lives? Because there's like several steps, just like surfing and learning to stand up on a surfboard. Like how do you learn how to surf? Like, oh, stand up. Like there's a lot of pieces to standing up before you get there, like the paddling out and the learning to pop up, and just so many components. And I wanted to be able to break that down because I think it's such an essential part of who we are and how to navigate our lives with intention and a spiritual connection. So, for me, my instincts, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of denial and gaslighting. And so I had really strong instincts from the beginning because I was, super hyper vigilant, and I'd had a lot of chaos. And then I was told that the things that I saw and witnessed weren't happening. The things that, had happened to me weren't true.
Yes.
So that,
Yeah.
That sends you into a spiral of like, can I even trust my own instincts? Like, can I even trust myself? And just like on a river where you end up swimming in a hole and you're recirculated and you don't know which way is up and how to get out. How do you get out of that? You're just caught in this cycle where you're just getting worked. We call it getting maytagged in rafting parlance. You're just getting maytagged in, gaslighting and denial and that family system, which I talk about overcoming the multi-generational cycles of trauma and abuse. And that's a huge part of it, of the cycle, is gaslighting and denial. That's how you keep the system going forward, right? So when I became a river guide and I started to rely on my instincts to survive, I had to, and it's what I had going for me. And when I would rely on my instincts, when the river would tell me which way to go, I put my hand in the water and I always ask for safe passage and for the river to show me the way, show me the line, and let my hands be your hands, and let my hands and my actions honor you. That it's a relationship that I'm having where I'm surrendering to the power of the river and asking for that inspiration and that instinct to put me where I need to be to have a good run and to be safe. The more that I developed that skill and that relationship, and it worked out for me time and time again, where I was having great lines, my coworkers were always like, how do you always have such great lines? And I'm like, well, the river tells me where to go, and I just listen and go. And I started to realize like that was a working part of my skill set and that I could trust it. And then something happens, and I talk about it in the book. Something happens next to the river where I'm confronted by a male coworker, and it's a scene of sexual harassment next to the river. And, my instinct as a trauma survivor is to disappear and dissociate, because that's what's kept me safe for what the generations of women in my family have done to survive, sexual trauma. And so I start to do that, but the river's right there holding up a mirror, like, who are you being right now? This isn't who you are. This isn't who I know you to be. And that extreme dichotomy of like who I am to the river in that relationship and who I was being, as a response to a traumatic upbringing. I chose to lean into, what I trusted with my instincts on the river. And that mechanism, like changing that mechanism, was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. And that's a huge part of like, how do you stand up on the surfboard? How do you pop up? It feels so foreign. It feels like you're, swimming underwater or trying to scream underwater. And like everything in you is like, no, be small, go in the cave. But there's this part of you that's like, wanting to change that mechanism and change your story, change the narrative, change your legacy, right? Through your DNA. It's like an evolutionary moment of shift. And it takes so much energy to do that. And I was so lucky that I was able to be on the river, next to the river, and to lean into that and have that aid from the river coming to my aid. And it came to my aid a couple of times in those situations and reminded me like, no, this isn't who you are. And making that choice and constantly stepping into who I was becoming and growing into, because rivers, it's such an easy metaphor, but like no river's the same, right? Like it's always changing and we're always growing into like the next version of ourselves, so it's just a great reminder to lean into that next version. And that's what helped me shift.
Well, and I do think it's very powerful in the book and in your life, how even though rivers change all the time, there's also been this, constant support that you've had that's far deeper, as you were saying, than any of the difficulties we have to deal with in life, that you can always go back to it, right? It's always there for you.
Yeah, it's something I can trust. And my relationship with the river is something I can trust. I know who I am there. And it's a place from which I can go out and have that belief in myself and know that I'm always welcomed and I always belong there.
There's a great Hemingway quote about he's in Paris and he's like, it's a beautiful day. The only thing that could ruin it was people. And it seems like for those of us who are close to nature, right, this is the way we are. Like we're okay. We're at home. We're peaceful. We're not hurt when we're in those places in nature. It's dealing with the people that's difficult, right?
Yeah, and with people who have been hurt, who are suffering and don't know how to get out of that cycle. So, yeah, it was a huge part of me wanting to release this book in the world to help people, learn how to recognize and break out of the cycle.
Yeah. And, I think we were talking about this. I was thinking when you talked about the river god, the anger in the world and anger and bullying and all that coming out of hurt. It seems like when we were children, there was definitely a lot more of that. And it was gaslit a lot more. It was allowed to happen. It feels like we were getting in a better place maybe with that. And now a lot of that anger is coming out more. And I think people are still in denial, right? I mean, how much sexual harassment still exists in places where people don't want to believe or don't want to admit it exists, like out in the wild, in the outdoor space, in the guiding space. It's still there, right? It's still ugly.
Yes, but I think that there has been a huge shift since, people are telling their stories and sharing their stories because we're as sick as our secrets. And when I thought I was the only person this was happening to, right? And it was something that I hid because I thought it would hinder me from advancing in my career. So it was just something I dealt with kind of by myself, and we didn't talk about it. And also it was like each of these instances didn't seem all that bad, in and of themselves. And we're conditioned to think like, oh, whatever, it's just a little bit of hazing, that happens. And, it wasn't until 2016, before the second wave of the Me Too movement, that there was that report filed by 13 women who had experienced sexual harassment while working for the Grand Canyon River District of the National Park Service. And that report detailed a pattern of sexual harassment. At that time, it was the U.S. Department of the Interior who had done a report. Well, you can't even find that report now. It's been
What?
scrubbed from the Department of Interior website. Yeah, I just tried to look it up the other day, and it's not there.
But the thing is, we can't hide from this behavior, right? People,
No,
can't pretend it
no,
didn't exist. You can't just scrub it
no,
away.
exactly. But what's interesting, so there are people who are trying to hide that it
Yeah.
existed, that it happened at that level. But what my personal experience of that was when I read that report. I remember it clearly. I was sitting on my patio having lunch, and I was reading the details of these women, what they'd gone through. And I was like, oh yeah, yeah, me too. And then I started writing in the margins, situations that I'd gone through that were identical to all of these claims. And I was like, oh, that's sexual harassment. I didn't realize that. And when you have when it's compiled all in one place and you see it, it's like death by 1,000 cuts,
Right.
like any little thing is, you can overcome it, but it's just that constant pervasive culture that's targeted at tearing you down, those microaggressions all the time, the jokes, the the shitty scheduling, the retaliation that happens when, and the constant sexual objectification, the constant putting women in these positions of having to absorb the sexual energy of everybody there, and still be able to do their job. It's just something that we learn how to navigate and still do our job. But when we all started saying no, these are the things and here's what it looks like. And I think a lot of even guides that I worked with when I did a couple of stories and I would say, hey, would you be able to talk to this reporter and just verify that this thing happened? And they're like, I never really saw any sexual harassment. And I was like, what about, and I would detail something that had happened and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's sexual harassment. Oh, okay. Now I'm okay. I see that now, but it's something that we didn't, it looks different than we thought it looked. Right. But now that we know what it looks like, and now that it's become in our consciousness, and so many people have come forward and done stories and told that, shared their stories, and people are more aware of it. One of the things that happened just with me, with my story, when I wrote an essay, I don't know if it's pronounced snooze or snooze.
Snooze, yeah.
Snooze. Okay, so I did an essay for snooze.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I got this. I got this message from the river ranger in the Bridger Teton National Forest, who's responsible for managing the Snake River and sexual harassment on the river. And so he contacts me and he's like, I was your river ranger at the time and I didn't know this was happening. What could I have done? Your essay really moved me. What could I have done to help you and protect you? And I was like, well, one, I didn't even know you existed. So that would be helpful to know that, like maybe in the bathroom or something, there could be a note, like if you're having problems, contact, me at this
Yeah.
number, like maybe a hotline, because, I was reporting sexual harassment to like my supervisors who were the creators of the culture, and sometimes they were the ones doing it. So like I'm supposed to report the behavior to the people who are doing it. Yeah. So having a third party, having a way, somebody that it could be anonymous. Like, so we went through this whole thing of like, what could have helped me and develop this protocol. And then he invited me to come to do a panel, the first ever panel. This was in 2018, the first ever panel for managing sexual harassment in the river industry at the River Management Society conference. And from that panel, sharing of stories, I shared my personal story, and then there were some other folks there doing some sharing as well. The A-Collaborative, the Anti-Discrimination and Sexual Harassment Collaborative, was born in 2019, and it provides consultation and training for outfitters and agencies and support for individual guides in the industry. And so now it's gone to where, like, if you're an outfitter and you're not having sexual harassment training for providing that as part of, like, you always have to recertify in first aid, CPR at the beginning of every season. And now it's like you have to do this sexual harassment training too. We never had that. We never had any sexual harassment training. So I think that there's this huge awareness and a huge shift and happening, and that it's not as prevalent as it was when I was a guide. Thank God. And, we have people like Maria Blevins doing amazing work on with statistics. And so we have measurable data now, which is huge to be able to point to specifically like this percentage and like kind of where it's happening. Because, when I worked in Idaho, there was a whole different situation than when I worked in California. Different regions have different cultures.
Yeah. And I think that, as a man, I think men have a huge responsibility to be there and be supportive. As you said, the other guides who wouldn't admit that it was going on, I think you do have these, abusers or toxic personalities out there who are also gaslighting and controlling and bullying the men around too, right? So it's this whole complex.
Yeah. But, it's the denial. It's denial.
Yeah.
It's part of, any kind of an oppressive system employs denial to keep the system functioning. Just like, coming from a dysfunctional family, there's denial. And it's the same situation in these guiding cultures as well. It plays out in the same way.
And it also seems important to me that men need to shut up and listen far too often than, they tend to, that it's really important to listen and not try to, form an opinion or say how it is or say how it affects you. But as a man hearing reports of sexual harassment, we have to stop and really listen and respect what we're hearing.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the moment of transformation, right? The going from like, no denial, going into that small cave inside yourself. This isn't happening. I'm not dealing with this, to the screaming underwater, the moving forward. Like, how do we shift the mechanism? How do we shift the machinery into going downstream? It's like, going from being in the eddy to being in the downstream current. How do we get across the eddy line? And, it takes focus, commitment, and like you said, listening, but also a willingness to see it differently. And, like my friend, when I was like, no, remember that time when, because I didn't sleep with the guy, he didn't let us use his rafts. And so we had to run around and try to find gear like at the 11th hour. And he was like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, that's retaliation. And he's like, oh, yeah. And he had this shift of like this awareness of like, oh, okay, that's what it looks like. And I'm willing to accept that point of view and like integrate it into the way I'm seeing the world too. because it's hard to make that shift.
Right.
It's so much easier to be like, no, that wasn't really happening. Maybe you're exaggerating. Maybe you're making it up. But to be like, yes, I'm willing to consider that that's true, and tell me more and be curious about it.
Well, and I think you also in the book get into this, and you were talking about it here too. It's really hard to break, uh, you know, past these cycles of generational trauma as well. Someone's been abused, they're going to continue the abuse in some way. Someone's been abused, they're going to continue to live in a state of denial, as you said you found yourself in. How can we break those generational cycles? How can we help other people break those generational cycles?
Such a great question. For me, I mean, it's the kind of the same answer for both family and the river culture, which I consider to be my family
Right.
too. And it really, like, for me with my dad, the work that we did to break the generational cycle of abuse in our family it was it was very difficult, and we had to take breaks a lot. I mean, we went to counseling together, and we'd have to hash out these really intense details of our relationship. And I would talk about how I felt when there was physical abuse, and he would get super angry and get into denial, and that never happened, and how dare you, and be really defensive. Right? There's a lot of that. Your initial reaction is to be defensive and to not want. You talk about listening, you can hear it, but to like take it into your heart and consider it, and then like how can I make a change and a shift in my behavior to meet this person where they're at, is so it takes a lot of courage and a lot of like surrender. It really, it takes a lot of surrender to step into that space with somebody and trust.
Right.
So we had a really deep trust of like, okay, we're going to do this together. We're going to like R2 this like gnarly canyon together. And I have to be able to trust you, because I'm going to throw some heavy stuff in the boat, and so are you. And we're going to have to like work this out. And it was not, sometimes we flipped, sometimes it would be this like, huge disaster. Like one time he overturned a table at the therapist's office, and the therapist is crying and like freaking out.
Wow.
And
Wow.
yeah, and then he storms out, and the therapist is like, "Oh my God, he's so intense." I'm like, "Yeah, no shit. What do you think I've been coming here for? This is what I'm talking about." But then, like coming back to like how, like taking breaks, we'd have to take breaks to cool off, and then come back together. Like, okay, we're still working on this. And I still trust, like, you haven't abandoned our project that we're doing together. I trust you're still in this, and we're still paddling. But sometimes, when you flip the raft and you're in between Maytag and Son of Maytag, you have to like right the raft, take a breather, drink some water, like kind of pull yourself together before you drop into the next one. So, that commitment to, I think it's like the commitment, like, I know you're in it. I know we're doing this. You're not going to bail on me. You're not going to hike out in the middle of this expedition, but also you're going to respect when I need to have a break, or I'm going to respect when you need a break, but we're still going to come back to this.
It's such compassion and love from you and from your dad to be able to make it through that.
Yeah. And that's, I feel like my relationship with my father is definitely one of the most significant relationships and there, like, he's almost my soulmate in that way, because we did have that deep commitment to like overturn this together. Like, we set out with this goal, like, we're going to change our legacy. We're going to change our family trajectory. We're going to do it together. And I trust that you have the fortitude to do it. And vice versa. And just that intense commitment right up to the end.
And I think that's a really important thing people can learn from the book, from your experience, right? That this is actually, it's possible to work through these things to make it, to change.
Yeah. And, I wasn't necessarily going to publish this book, but my father made me promise, it was a deathbed promise that I would do it. And, and so I did, to honor him, and he really wanted our story to be known, that it is possible. And that's our legacy. That's what we worked on together, and that's what we have to share with the world.
It's beautiful. And, I guess we talked about how wild places and rivers and being out there can get you through trauma. And help you resist it even. What about healing? How have you found healing in nature, in the river, in the way you live your life?
Well, I think there's, just having that unconditional love that I didn't necessarily have growing up provides a sense of healing. Like there's, I'm not constantly trying to win approval or trying to get someone to see me in a way that I want to be seen. I just am accepted as I am. And I can, and that when you're not constantly having to like do this tap dance underwater, like of trying to get approval from the people who are charged with providing your care for you, um, and you can just be yourself and be loved for who you are. That for me has provided the healing.
Now, maybe on a lighter note or a more fun note, one of the things I loved about this book, I thought was so great, is it's almost got like a beat feel to it as far as just what it's like to live in a mountain town. It captures mountain town life in a fun way in a lot of spots, despite dealing with so many heavy things. And in a way, I always feel like this outdoor mountain town life is sort of marginalized in the American experience, but you really bring it front and center in this book as it being a real and valid part of life today. How important is it to you to be sort of this muse of mountain town culture? As I was going to say, in everything from car racks to speed to powder days, as part of the day to day experience of life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I loved about writing this book was, I'm a closet anthropologist and I studied anthropology at university and I have a minor in Native American studies. Like I love ethnography and just culture and language. And so I worked with what I had, that was the culture I was raised in. So I really wanted to represent that and explore it in all the ways and share that. Because I think it is super special and it's quirky and it's got a lot of attributes and characteristics that people who aren't from a mountain town don't understand.
And it's one of the successes, I think, of this book too. Is despite dealing with really heavy stuff, it's also a fun read. It's also a lot of fun in there, especially if you spend any time in a mountain town. And also, I love the joy of your childhood in the book is very prominent as well. And I wonder how now, as a mother with two daughters, how do you share that joy with your children in a really, positive way?
Yeah, basically my whole parenting philosophy is just guiding. I just guide my kids. And like we run a lot of river trips, and they've been guided, like going on trips with other river guide families, with other kids, and since they were little and they had binkies on their life jackets, and we go with kind of as a big group of us and all the kids have grown up together and they're like they call each other river cousins, and they like that lifestyle and just the freedom, like they love being in kid pack and just running free when we're in camp. Or like our oldest daughter paddled the San Juan by herself when she was 10, in her little inflatable kayak, and she felt so accomplished at the end of it and went back to school. And what'd you do on your spring break? Like, oh, I paddled the entire length of the San Juan River by myself, and here are the blisters on my hands to prove it. And to see them gain that sense of accomplishment and self-esteem, because we gain self-esteem by doing esteemable acts, and kids are so disempowered in so many ways now, like with helicopter parenting, like everything's taken care of for them. And like there's this, I think Gen X, we were so like not protected that we've gone the other direction,
Yes.
to like make sure nothing
Yeah.
happens. But being somebody who feels the most comfortable in nature, like I trust nature more than I trust society, right? And human culture. I've taught my kids the skills that they need to survive, and then like let them go, and it's just a joy to see that flourish, and carry, like, they came home the other day and they were so upset. They'd seen some girls from school. The yucca flowers bloom here in June, and we all love yucca. And they'd seen these girls like pull the flowers out before they'd even bloomed and were using them as swords, and they were horrified. They came home just so upset because now they can't bloom this year, and how could you? They were just devastated. So that's how I keep the magic alive, and just, continuing to nurture that relationship with myself and with my family.
So getting back to the dark stuff, anger, bullying, harassment, it feels like we're in a time now when that stuff is being legitimized again, right? And we also have this current violence and destruction facing public lands and wild spaces. It feels like, you and your voice and your presence right now could be a really good guide for people on how to navigate what's going on in the current times. How do you see yourself helping people through what we're facing now?
Well, I think all of us, should, and for me especially, like, I look at, like, how can I do what I can where I am with what I have? Like, stay in, like, what's my lane? Because I can't do it all of it. But the Channel Islands is outside my door, and my husband and I met on San Miguel Island in the Channel Islands, and it's very important to us and to our family, and it's being threatened with deep sea mining right now. And it's been proposed that Santa Rosa Island be taken out of Channel Islands National Park, which is insane and absurd. So, and I was sharing that with my girls this morning. They were completely outraged and like, no, that can't happen, because we're stewards of the Channel Islands. We're stewards of this place where we've grown up. So I think all of us taking ownership, I don't even like the word ownership, but like taking responsibility for the relationships with the land that we are nurtured by, like the places that inform us and speak to who we are. We have to continue to speak for those places and use what we have to do so.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we're down to the final question that we ask everyone at the end of this podcast. And it is a very simple one, and I'm excited to hear your answer. And that is just, what gives you hope?
I love that question. And I think there's always hope, I get a lot of hope from people who are still wanting to learn how to grow in their relationships, how to grow in their skills, how to grow as outdoor people and stewards, environmentalists. Just the question, like, what can people do? Like, it speaks to wanting to grow into that next version of ourselves that this moment is calling from all of us. So that gives me hope for all the people who are answering that call.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you again for being on the show. And one more time, The River's Daughter. It's a beautiful, difficult, and fun book. If something can be all those three things together, I hope
just like a river trip.
That's very true. Yes, I hope that people flock to it. And once again, what's the best way to find that is through independent booksellers would be your advice?
Yeah, or you can go to my website. I have all the links there, bridgetcrocker.com. There's all the information about trips that I'm running and book events. I'm coming to a mountain town near you this summer, so I hope to see all of you on the road.
That's fantastic. And I hope people come out to see you. Please do. Bridget, it was really amazing to have you on the show. Thank you so much for all you do and all you bring.
Thank you so much, Doug. It was such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for imbibing Open Container, a production of Rockfight LLC. Please take a second to follow our show on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, and send your emails and feedback to myrockfight@gmail.com. Learn more about Bridget Crocker and her new book, The River's Daughter, at bridgetcrocker.com. Our producers today were David Karstad and Colin True. Art direction provided by Sarah Gensert. I'm Doug Schnitzbahn. Get some. Thanks for listening.